Let's go Dolphins! I have a question for you. What if one of the worst ideas for the Miami Dolphins this entire offseason just became one of the hottest topics among NFL analysts? Because a trade proposal has suddenly put the Dolphins in the middle of a conversation that, honestly, I never expected to see. And trust me, the more I looked into it, the less sense it started to make. Here's what happened. A recent proposal suggested that the Miami Dolphins should pursue a trade for San Francisco 49ers wide receiver Brandon Aiyuk. At first, some fans immediately focused on one thing: the talent. After all, everyone knows what Aiyuk was capable of when he was playing at his best. But once you dig a little deeper into the situation, the story becomes much more complicated than simply adding another receiver. Because yes, the Dolphins could certainly use another weapon at wide receiver. That's not really the debate. The real question is this: is Brandon Aiyuk actually the right player for this football team? Or would bringing him to Miami create more problems than solutions? And honestly, after everything that's been reported over the past year, I think that's a fair question every Dolphins fan should be asking. The proposal argues that Miami should be aggressive because the current receiver room still has plenty of question marks. It also points out that offensive coordinator Bobby Slowick previously worked with Aiyuk in San Francisco, creating an obvious connection between the player and Miami's coaching staff. On paper, it sounds interesting. A proven receiver, a familiar offensive coordinator, a team looking for more help around Malik Willis. But football isn't played on paper, and that's where this entire conversation starts to fall apart. Before we continue, make sure you've already smashed that like button if you're excited to see the Dolphins continue building this roster the right way. And today I want to hear from the most optimistic Dolphins fans watching. Comment below. Go Dolphins! Build it the right way. Let's see how many Dolphins fans believe this team should stay patient instead of forcing risky moves. Now, my personal opinion is simple. Every team should always look for ways to improve, especially at important positions like wide receiver. But not every talented player is the right fit. Talent alone doesn't build winning football teams. Character matters. Availability matters. Locker room chemistry matters. And organizational vision matters. That's why I think this discussion is much bigger than Brandon Aiyuk himself. It's really about the type of football team the Dolphins are trying to become under this new leadership. Now, let's be completely honest. Nobody is questioning Brandon Aiyuk's talent. At his best, he proved he could be one of the league's most productive receivers. His 2023 season showed exactly the type of impact he was capable of making when healthy and fully involved in an offense. But that's only one part of the story. Because since then, things have changed dramatically. A major injury interrupted his momentum. He appeared in only 7 games during the 2024 season. Then came another year in which he never returned to the field while continuing his recovery, creating even more uncertainty surrounding his future. And that's where Dolphins fans need to ask themselves a simple question. Are you trading for the player who dominated in 2023? Or are you trading for the uncertainty that has followed him ever since? That's a massive difference. The proposal itself even suggests Miami could potentially acquire him for very little compensation. On the surface, that sounds tempting. Low risk, potentially high reward. But football decisions aren't made by looking only at draft picks. You also have to consider everything that comes with the player. According to the discussion, that's where the biggest concern begins. The conversation points to Aiyuk's recent activity on social media and the ongoing tension surrounding his relationship with the 49ers organization. Several public posts were highlighted as examples of the situation becoming increasingly complicated, raising questions about whether bringing that environment into a young team would actually be beneficial. And honestly, that may be the biggest reason why this proposal doesn't feel like a realistic fit. Because if there's one thing we've already started noticing about this Dolphins regime, it's that there appears to be a strong emphasis on building the right culture. Every move, every signing, every draft selection, everything seems to point toward assembling players who fit the vision the organization is trying to create. That's why this trade feels difficult to imagine. Not because Miami couldn't use another receiver. They absolutely could. The discussion itself acknowledges that the current receiver room still has significant questions, especially as the team looks to support Malik Willis with more dependable targets. But adding talent and adding the right talent are two completely different things. Sometimes the most important decision a front office makes is deciding which move not to make. Then there's another factor that can't be ignored. Money. Aiyuk signed a major contract not long ago. Even if the trade compensation itself isn't overwhelming, taking on a significant financial commitment for a player surrounded by so many questions becomes a much bigger decision. And when you combine the contract, the recent injury history, the uncertainty surrounding his future, and everything else that's been discussed, you begin to understand why this proposal has generated such divided opinions. Personally, I think the Dolphins should absolutely continue exploring ways to strengthen the wide receiver room. But I also believe every addition has to match the direction this organization is trying to establish. Building around Malik Willis isn't simply about collecting recognizable names. It's about finding players who can grow together within the system. Players who fit the culture. Players who help create long-term stability. And based on everything discussed surrounding Brandon Aiyuk, it's fair to wonder whether he truly checks all of those boxes. But here's where the story takes another interesting turn. Because even though this proposal doesn't seem like the ideal solution, there are still several wide receivers who could become realistic trade targets for Miami. But here's the important part. Rejecting the Brandon Aiyuk idea doesn't mean the Dolphins should stop looking for help at wide receiver. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The discussion makes it clear that Miami still has work to do at the position. The goal should simply be finding the right player, not just the biggest name available. And that's where the conversation starts becoming much more interesting. Because after explaining why Aiyuk doesn't appear to be the ideal fit, several other potential trade targets were brought into the discussion. One name that continues to stand out is Keyshawn Bout. Among all the possible receivers mentioned, he's described as one of the most intriguing options for Miami. Why? Because over the last 2 seasons, Bout has quietly produced back-to-back campaigns with more than 550 receiving yards. Even more impressive, he developed a reputation as one of the league's most effective deep ball receivers, showing the ability to consistently create explosive plays down the field. That kind of skill set naturally catches your attention, especially for a team trying to give Malik Willis more reliable weapons. Of course, there's one obvious obstacle. He's currently with the New England Patriots. Making a trade within the division is never simple. That alone could make any potential deal extremely difficult, regardless of how appealing the player might be. Then another name entered the conversation. Jaylen McMillan. And honestly, this might be one of the more underrated possibilities discussed. McMillan was highlighted as a player with intriguing upside who could potentially become available depending on how Tampa Bay decides to manage its wide receiver depth chart. The discussion points out that Tampa Bay has several receivers competing for opportunities. If that depth eventually creates a roster squeeze, McMillan could become someone worth monitoring. He's viewed as a receiver capable of lining up both inside and outside, while still offering room for development. That's the kind of player who fits the profile of someone a team could target without making an overwhelming investment. Other names were also mentioned as possibilities to monitor, including Rashad Bateman, Jerry Jeudy, and Brian Thomas Jr., reinforcing the idea that Miami has alternatives if it chooses to explore the trade market. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this entire discussion. The Dolphins don't necessarily need to make a splash. They need to make the right decision. Sometimes the smartest move isn't the one that creates the biggest headline. It's the one that quietly improves the roster while protecting the culture you're trying to build. That's why I keep coming back to the same conclusion. If Miami decides to add another receiver, the organization